This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Today's episode is super special because our guest is none other than Tema Okun. You may not know her by name, but you're probably familiar with the work she's done around naming characteristics of white supremacy culture. When the fight for racial justice was reignited last spring, it became clear to the Amplify RJ team that we needed to be more explicit about naming restorative justice philosophy, practices, and values as antidotes to racism and white supremacy in our work, and Tema's work has been a major resource for us. If you want to see how we've integrated her work into what we teach, check out all our upcoming learning opportunities at amplifyrj.com/learn. I got most of the fanboying out of the way before we got to recording, but I was still super excited to get to talk to one of our major influences. Apologies in advance for being able to hear my breathing during some of Tema's talking. I'm still new to the podcast game and I'm working out the recording nuances. Less of me, more of our conversation. Let's get to it. Welcome, Tema. Who are you?
I am Tema Okun, the daughter of Beth Okun and Dan Okun, and the granddaughter of Leah Okun and Will Okun, and the great-granddaughter of Tema Okun.
Who are you?
I am someone who grew up in the South, in an elite college town, and am deeply informed by that environment.
Who are you?
I am someone who had the great good fortune to partner with my beloved colleague Kenneth Jones for 12 years before he died prematurely in 2004, and learn from him and his incredible wisdom.
Who are you?
I am a great aunt of 4 incredible children named Ida and May and Miles and Griffin, and I love them more than I knew love could be.
Who are you?
I am a member of a very strong community of beloved friends who make me very happy, who hold me in love, and who hold me accountable in the most wonderful way.
2 more. Who are you?
I am a teacher and an educator, and I've been teaching and learning about how white supremacy and racism operate for over 30 years now.
Yeah. And finally, who are you?
I am a child of God.
Well, I am so excited to be talking with you today. We're going to talk about all the intersections of that. I already shared that. For those of you who can't see, I can see the wonderful artwork from your great niece in the background on Zoom. For those of you who aren't watching this, you're missing out. But it's always good to start off by checking in. So with the fullness of this question, we're recording this on January 15. How are you?
Well, there's how I am personally, and there's sort of how I am in the context of what's happening in the world, and those two things are definitely connected. I feel like I don't know what the emotion is. I'm witnessing this sort of breaking apart in a new kind of way. I mean, I completely agree with everyone who says that what's happening at the Capitol and sort of the assault on the Capitol is not new. I do think it's unprecedented in its graphic lived reality in my lifetime, and I am really intrigued to see how it's shaking some things open. And I think, I don't know what the long-term impact is going to be. I feel like I'm seeing more truth-telling than I have in a long time about how whiteness and white supremacy work. And I'm grateful for that. I would guess I'm sitting in wonder about what that's going to mean for us as a movement, social justice movement, and how we're going to move forward with all of that. So I sit in a lot of not knowing, which is my pretty constant state. And I would say, in terms of how I am personally, that I feel like I've become an expert surfer, that I surf between suffering and grace on a daily basis. So just depends whether you catch me on the top of the wave or underneath the water. And both places are interesting places to be. So how are you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Not everyone turns it back to me. Today, I'm a little bit relieved because in this moment, I'm a little bit relieved because the person that I'm talking to, who I was scheduled to talk to after you, had to cancel. So it's like, yes, my Friday got a little bit less stressful. And like, I think that goes to show, like, how busy I am, and like needing to know that like it's okay to not do all of these things. And I think like one of the things that I want to talk to you about is like, the sense of urgency to get all these things done that I believe so deeply need to be out in the world. And how do I, right, not buy into grind culture and just like producing. And so I'm aware of that busyness, but like I'm excited by it and simultaneously exhausted by it. And then like, with all the other things going on in the world, if we even look back to, June, May of last year, when, the racial reckoning was reignited, I was doing this work before that, and I'll still be doing this work after that. Like, the need for doing this hasn't changed. It's just like I have, experienced a lot of people like spark interest, and that interest fades, right? And it's like, all right, I guess baby steps, we can celebrate those wins, but like, how do we continue to provide experiences and resources for people to continue to want to do this work? And so like, that's the perpetual challenge for me. And I think one of the exciting things about being a younger person in this work, like I just turned 30, right? And having some experience behind me is like, I see all the possibilities, but knowing that I can't do them all. So that's a struggle. You've been doing this work for, as long as I've been alive. And even before that, I was just watching a video of you sharing a very early experience when you understood that, like, as a white person, I am racist. Would you mind sharing some of that story as a starting point for this conversation?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I tell it a lot, so apologies if anybody's heard it before. But I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is the flagship college town of the state university system, predominantly white system. It was created for the sons of plantation holders and the power elite in the state. And I grew up in a household with two very liberal parents, and I mean that in the best sense of the word and even the limited sense of the word. And so I grew up in a household with a lot of racial equity talk. My parents were active in the civil rights movement and were very explicit about those values. And so that was a good start for me, a good context in which to grow up. And I'm not gonna. There were also mixed messages. It wasn't always a clear message. And one of the ways that there was a clear message. So during my growing up, I grew up during the very end of Jim Crow in the South, and I also grew up during the desegregation of the public schools. And so my high school desegregated as I was entering high school. And what that meant was that in Chapel Hill, they built a whole new high school on what was then the edge of town, and they called it Chapel Hill High, which was the name of the white high school. And they brought all the students from Chapel Hill High, which which was the white high school, and the students from Lincoln High, which was the black high school, together in this new building. And they essentially kept the identity of the white high school intact, the names of the teams, the colors of the school, the school culture, the colors, the mascot, the principal. The white principal became the principal, the black principal became the assistant principal, and like other schools across the South, the school system pretty much fired all of the black teachers and hired white people to take their place in this sort of cultural assumption that that white teachers were more qualified, that white students wouldn't learn from black teachers, and that white teachers would know how to teach black students, which they did not. So it was a shit show, if I may say so. And
you may.
And the black students were, so I was not, although I grew up in this household where there was racial equity talk, I wasn't all that, I didn't have a sophisticated understanding of it. And I was in high school, my hormones were raging, and what I cared about, and I'm not proud to admit this, but what I cared about was, was I likable? Was I popular? Was I pretty? All sort of the conditioned things that I was supposed to be, I was taught to care about as a young white girl, trying to fit in and belong in my crowd. And the black students, on the other hand, were very upset about this. At Lincoln they'd had control of everything, the paper, the proms, the teams, and now they were worse than second-class citizens. So they were protesting and sitting in lobbies, and at some point we formed a race council. So I was involved enough to participate in this thing called the race council, where black students and white students would get together. And at that point, as far as I know, there weren't any Latinx students in the school. Get together in each other's houses, and we would talk. And so one night we had a race council meeting at my house, and we had a suburban ranch house, so the bottom was a kind of a basement, a finished basement, where my parents would have parties and stuff. And so we were down there, and I was talking, I'm using air quotes, talking to another classmate named Sylvester, African-American classmate named Sylvester, and he was telling me I was racist. He was saying, "You're racist." And I was going, "No, I'm not." He's going, "Yes, you are." I'm going, "No, I'm not." He's going, "Yes, you are." I'm going, "No, I'm not." And that was our conversation, And I said, "Okay, stop. I have to go get refreshments." And I walk upstairs, and my mother turns to me and she says, "Get a grip. You're a white girl growing up in a racist country. You're racist. Deal with it." And that was a life changer and a real gift from my mother, because it meant at a very early age I was encouraged to rather than defend against this idea of my own racism, to turn it around and actually look at it. And so it really changed my life. And she didn't remember telling me that, and I thanked her for it several times as I got older and understood how important that was. But
where did that understanding come from her?
I have no idea. I really don't, because I'm not going to get into my relationship with my mother, but it was, we didn't really talk about things in depth. She grew up in Texas. She grew up as a poor white girl in Texas. She had to work her way through school, and she met my father in New Orleans, and they got married, and she became estranged from her family because my father was Jewish, and she married a Jewish man. So I don't really know where she got that understanding.
Yeah, and there have always been people who are white who have had this understanding, and you make this point in your book, The Emperor Has No Clothes. All of this truth is out there. It is very, very visible for anyone to see if you decide that you're going to look at it. And so many people, and I'm not just going to say white people, so many people in general choose not to see that we are all steeped in the United States, right? Steeped in a culture of white supremacy. And that is the introduction that many people have to your work. If you've come to an Amplify RJ workshop, one of the things that we asked you to do is read that 8-page article co-authored by Kenneth Jones and yourself about, the way that white supremacy culture shows up in organizations, right? But just in our culture at large. I often say to people, when we're talking about white supremacy culture, yes, using the N-word, marching with the Klan, that's the overt parts of it that anybody, where we are now, I'm not going to say anybody, but most people will distance themselves from and say no, that's bad, right? But there are these 15 characteristics that you've listed, and not an exclusive list of characteristics that you've come up with that have really showed how whiteness is normalized, held up to a higher standard. I'm curious, how did you and Kenneth, and I know there are so many other people who contribute to that, develop that?
Countless people. So I want to say that that it was a result of Kenneth and I had been doing work together for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years by then, and he was my elder by a couple of years and much more experienced than I was. So I considered myself his mentee, learning from him, and we would do workshops. And the goal of the workshops that we did was to work with people to give them a grounding framework in how white supremacy and racism operate, so that there would be shared language and a shared framework for then starting to set some explicit goals for people's racial equity commitment. And we've been doing that for a long time by that point. And I'd had the privilege of working with all kinds of people who would come to the workshops, and my learning was deepening all the time. And I think I was living in San Francisco for a year at that point, and Kenneth and I were doing a lot of work on the West Coast. And I had just gone to a People's Institute workshop where a man named Daniel Buford was doing some really amazing and deeply brilliant work on racial linguistics, on the way that racism is embedded in our language. And if people don't know, the People's Institute is based in New Orleans and is sort of considered the grandparent of contemporary anti-racist community-based education and training. And so Kenneth and I were learning from them, and I would go and take one of their workshops whenever I could. And I was also participating in the Challenging White Supremacy workshops led by a woman named Sharon Martinez in the Bay Area. So I was getting a lot of this, I was sort of in this very steeped environment where I was learning a lot. And then I went to a meeting, and I cannot remember the meeting that I went to, but I went to a meeting where most of those characteristics showed up. And so I came, and I was so frustrated. And I think it was the combination of having been to training, being in this meeting, working with Kenneth, and I came home, and this piece came through me onto the computer. And when people say I didn't write that, it came through me. I know that was my experience. I haven't had that experience with any other piece of writing, but it's not like I sat down and deliberately wrote it. It's sort of like my frustration put it on the page. And then, and you'll see that some of them are credited to Daniel Buford because of the influence that he had on my thinking. And then Kenneth credited just because he looked at it, and he was very unhappy that I put his name on it. It's like, I didn't write this, you wrote it, you shouldn't be crediting me. And it's one of the few times when I didn't listen to him. Because and as the paper says, I credit everyone who, because it came through me, I don't feel like it's mine in any kind of way. And I love how people have taken it and adapted it and revised it and added to it and illustrated it, and I think it has its own life in the sense of because it's just reflecting back to us what we're all dealing with.
Yeah, we'll get the plug in for the upcoming website now. It's coming in the next month or so. When it's up, we'll have a link to it in the show notes if you're listening to this later. But white supremacy, characteristics of white supremacy .info, perhaps. We're not sure. Working it out. But yeah, so for those of you who are listening to this in the future, that'll be linked for you in the show notes. For those of you who are listening to this now, stay tuned. We'll definitely be sharing. The way that you've spelled this out, both with characteristics and antidotes, have been so helpful for the Amplify RJ community, right? Because when I think about restorative justice, I came into restorative justice from the perspective, like, I was working in an employment program, helping people find work. Those who had records were having the hardest. Records in the criminal legal system were the people who had the hardest time finding work, right? And so for me, it was like, we need something else. There needs to be an alternative to this. And that was my initial introduction to the word restorative justice, right? But years later, and as I've learned from so many other elders, restorative justice is not just about repairing harm, right? It's about leaning on our ancestral values of interconnection, right? Ubuntu and Lak'ech, Kapwa, Mitakuyasin. Like, people who listen to this podcast hear me say this all the time, but it's how we proactively live into this work to, build relationships. Part of that is with people who are different than us. And so, posing these practices and philosophies and values against white supremacy culture, like these are the things that are the remedies towards that. And so when we think about, one right way, in our trainings, I've come to just say one white way of thinking and objectivity. Restorative justice talks about, like, we're able to hold multiple truths. We all come from different perspectives, right? It doesn't just have to be whatever's written on the page for, like somebody came up with that at one point in time and we wrote it, and it doesn't have to be that way forever, right? We think about this idea of production, and doing things with a sense of urgency, doing things on scale, and not really caring about the people. Restorative justice is all about taking care of people and process, like you say in the article, and making sure that we're leaning on the wisdom of our ancestors to make decisions that aren't just going to benefit us now, but generations to come. Not wanting to address power differences and conflict, raise conflict. Like, restorative justice practices allow us to, normalize that, as you say in the article, but also like give us a framework to practice and grow from that conflict, right? To build deeper connections, right? It's not just that we're trying to solve a problem, we're trying to make a relationship whole, even if it wasn't whole to start with, right? And all the other things around individualism, paternalism, right? Making sure that, power is shared. People are given the opportunity to make choices for themselves. We're doing these things collaboratively, not unilaterally making decisions. Like, when I was first exposed to your article, it's like, yes, like this is exactly that. I don't have a clean question coming out of that, but I'm just curious for the things that came to mind after hearing me lay that all out.
Well, I love how you I love how you've strung them together and talk and shown how they reinforce each other. It's not, there's nothing linear about them. There's no hierarchy about them. And I think what strikes me is this, and I'm not saying anything I haven't said probably a million times before, but to me, the important thing for us to understand is that the purpose of white supremacy and the purpose of racism is disconnection. And it's not just disconnection across lines of race, but it's disconnection within racialized groups. So within the white group, its purpose is to cause disconnection, which we're seeing play out on the national stage. Within groups, communities of color, its purpose is disconnection, and then disconnection within ourselves. So its purpose is to disconnect us from ourselves, and then its purpose for those of us who believe in some kind of spirit divine, its purpose is to disconnect us from that. So that's its whole purpose, in order to, because as long as we're disconnected, the people who are interested only in power and profit can pursue power and profit, because we're so disconnected. We're divided. It's the whole divide and conquer. We're divided from ourselves, so we're in a lot of pain. We're numbing ourselves. We're addicted to things. We're killing ourselves. We're killing each other. It's and I think so. There's that piece of it, the disconnection piece of it, and then you referenced this early when we were talking. The denial piece is so huge, and I think watching what's happening nationally and the huge numbers of people who have been told this lie over and over and over again that Biden stole the election, who believe that in the face of incredible evidence to the contrary, and then so there's people who are getting bad information and they believe it, and they're in a certain kind of denial. Then there are the people who are creating the manipulation, who know it's not true, and are using that manipulation and counting on people's ability to be in denial. So it's just the other piece of white supremacy and racism, it's how much denial is required, and you can only deny if you're completely cut off from yourself and from others. And so it's just, the the evidence of the harm that white supremacy and racism cause is everywhere in our levels of addiction, our levels of suicide and homicide, our levels of and in the white community, those levels are actually higher than in other communities. So so I think that's what I wanted to talk about, is just that it's all about disconnection. And so part of the antidote, and Sharon Martinez gets credit for that, because I'd written a list of characteristics and shared it with her, and she said you can't offer these without offering antidotes. So she gets credit for that. And that the antidote in a general sense is connection. Like what do we do to stay connected to ourselves, to spirit, to each other? And it's not that there's an easy answer to that, because we're still going to be in conflict with each other. It's not like loving each other is an easy thing to do. It's one of the hardest things in the world to do sometimes. And that's really what restorative justice to me, or what equity is, what racial justice is, what social justice is what serves connection. To the earth, to our natural resources, to living things.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just humans, it's, all beings. I'm going to ask you the impossible question of, how do we get reconnected when we are so polarized right now?
Well, if I had the answer to that. So I will tell you that I feel like, and I haven't shared this actually publicly before, as I've been watching this last week and witnessing and reading all the brilliant things that people are saying about, as we try to make sense of it. I'm thinking particularly about an article I just read by Eric Ward, who's the head of the Western State Center in Oregon, talked about how, if we understand our history at all, we understand how Black freedom movements have helped white people more than any white supremacist movement ever has, right?
If you're listening to this within a month of when it airs, our community member Demoite Wesley will be highlighting the work of Black freedom fighters like Frederick Douglass, Angela Davis, Miriam Kaba, and more in an interactive workshop on the history of Black abolition movements from chattel slavery to the new Jim Crow. It'll be Saturdays, February 6 and 27 from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific. Link to sign up in the show notes.
So I think that this connection that we're seeking, it's a collective practice. I think one of the things that our movement needs to learn is how to create belonging. We need to become more skilled at how to create belonging for and with each other. I think about how on the right, really the invitation is to belong, and the common thread is, if you come and belong to us, then here's all the people we can hate, and here's all the people we can go after. And on the left, I think the belonging gets more complicated, and sometimes we get confused, and it's like you can only belong if you show up in this kind of way, and you believe these kinds of things, and you behave like this, and we can be pretty hard on each other. I think we're learning. To me, we need to constantly ask as part of our strategies, what are we doing to create and support belonging? And it doesn't mean, again, that that's easy, because the other contradiction that we're holding at all times is that, and again, I'm generalizing here, but for most people and communities of color, BIPOC people and communities, the need for justice is 400 years old, if not more. And white people, we're still trying to catch on to what's happening, and that tension is always present.
Yeah, there's a couple things that sparks for me. One, a couple episodes ago, Annie Booth talked about how, again, if we're speaking generally, on the left, we're very good at wrong spotting, right? Picking out all the ways that people don't show up in this correct way. And, I think quote unquote cancel culture is an overcorrection for a lot of harm done that hasn't been addressed. And, as a restorative justice practitioner, cancel culture is all about throwing people away, right? And but the intention for that is for the harm to stop. And so when you're saying hey, stop it, how do we do that while like how do we show the harm, tell people to stop, and like invite them in at the same time. I think it was in the conversation between Adrienne Marie Brown and Angela Davis. It could have been somebody else. I listen to a lot of things, but I think Adrienne was talking about how as we're inviting people in, like the I guess like the barriers to entry into our movement need to be very low. We need to be very welcoming, and at the same time, we need to be holding people to high standards for like what we will embrace here. And it's not like you as a person are excluded because you do these things, but like this behavior is not tolerated in this space. And I don't think many people are skilled at lovingly saying stop. And I think part of that is because like we are already disconnected. You have a lot easier time saying stop to someone who you're already in relationship with than someone who you don't know. And I think one of the things that I'm wrestling with as someone who grew up in the world where, and who has like built this community around people who didn't know each other in March, like, we're all across the world. And I'm not connected to like really significantly to the people who live like to the left and right and across the street from me.
Yeah, you've said a couple of important things there. I think I keep thinking about I've read a few books by Chris Picciolini comes to mind, and I know I've read a few more by people who used to be active white supremacists or white nationalists and talk about how they were recruited in and then how they got out. And what they say about how they were recruited in was that it was about belonging. It wasn't about ideology in the beginning. It's like usually the two cases I'm thinking about were people who felt very isolated, very unseen. Then people on the right saw them, said, "You belong here. We'll take care of you. We'll love on you." And then once they were in, introduced the ideology and were brought into the ideology. And I think we kind of do it. And again, I'm generalizing. We kind of do it the other way around. It's like, here's the ideology, and if you, so trying to learn about what does it mean to invite people to belong, and then I think the other important point you made was that how do we talk about the behaviors that we want and need from each other without assigning them to our essential being, right? So there's a difference between my conditioning and who I am. I think I'm deeply conditioned into performing racism in my everyday life. I'm often encouraged into it. But who I am as and I hate it when I act out of that conditioning or any of my other conditioning, my gender conditioning, my age conditioning, all the different ways I'm conditioned by this toxic culture. And it's my conditioning. It's who I am essentially is pretty fabulous. And so it's like, how do we see the fabulousness in each other while being able to say, you have to really stop it. And to me, the key is helping each other see that behavior, acting out of that conditioning doesn't actually serve us. It might feel good in the moment to be defensive. It might feel good in the moment to go on the attack. It might feel in the moment good to microaggress. It might feel good to do any of the behaviors that are on that list. But those are short-term gains, and in the long term, they're not. The more I let go of those behaviors, the happier I am, and that is the truth.
For someone who's not white, right? There are definitely behaviors here that I practice that are upholding a culture of white supremacy, right? And some of those things are easier for me to see when I'm in community with people who look like me or who have experienced harm in this way. You didn't necessarily have exposure to that. You weren't looking when you were growing up. How did you continue to like become aware and then like develop?
Well, I think, there's been a lot of grace in my life, and I think a lot of that grace has been being in deep and loving relationship with people of color who brought a lot of patience to their relationship with me. Being in deep and loving relationship with white people who were smart and thoughtful and more experienced and who have supported me. I think, yeah. So relationships are relationships are the way that I learn. I don't learn. I do learn from books and I do learn from media, but I mostly learn from other people, and so that's been a big part of it. I think, and then I think about things like, I, this is more recent, but it's expressed so well. There's a wonderful interview that Toni Morrison did with Charlie Rose before he got Me Too'd out. So it was quite a few years ago, but I only saw it recently. And she talks about how she was always very clear that she had the moral high ground and that the African American community had the moral high ground. And she said something to the effect, and she says it much better, that when the only way you can stand tall is by having your knee on my neck, then there's something really wrong with you. And so, I mean, that's just, I think at a certain point, as you start to, as any of us start to understand how white supremacy and racism work, we're going to come face to face with how corrupting it is to us. And the other thing I'll say is that another person whose name I want to call is Sai Khan. He was my boss for many years at a place called Grassroots Leadership. And I remember one day I was getting ready to come to a meeting, and this was before the internet. And so we were talking on I lived in a town that was 2.5 miles away from where the meeting was. And so he called me, he said, "Are you getting ready to come?" This is a white man, a white Jewish man. And he calls me, he says, "Are you getting ready to come to the meeting?" I said, "Yeah, I'm getting in the car." He says, "Well, I don't want you to come if you can't come with a good attitude." I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And we had a biracial staff, and we were supporting community organizing in the South. And he said, "Well, when you come, all you do is you point out what's wrong. All you do is point out what's wrong. And you're bringing down the morale of the group when you do that." And in the moment, I just, basically I said, "F you, I'm not coming to no stinking meeting." And I hung up the phone and, was outraged. And then I actually sat and thought about what he'd said. And so it was revelatory, that conversation. And thank goodness this was early in my career. One, I had no idea that pointing out what was wrong, I thought that's what people did. I didn't know it was a choice I was making. I mean, that was my conditioning from my role in my family and what I had been taught by my parents, and that my job was to point out everything that was wrong. I didn't know I was making a choice. So he taught me I was making a choice, and I certainly didn't know I had the power to bring down the morale of a group. It's like, what? And so I think when you ask how do I know that there's a price for putting my knee on somebody else's neck, it's this just the way that people around me have helped me to. It's the way I learned that the critical voices that I was, the skill I had at pointing out what was wrong out there was the same voice that I was turning on myself. And so I've had to work through a lot of self-hate, frankly, and just seeing the ways in which my conditioning as a white person actually leads me to hate myself. So it's just been a long process of witnessing, watching, seeing how it operates, seeing how people who misuse and abuse their power really aren't very happy people. And I think what we want, all of us, if I can generalize, is to be joyful and connected to each other, not to be worrying about how much power we have over the next person.
Yeah, there's so many people who talk about how do we make our movement like irresistible, right? And joyful. And, it's really hard to do that when, we're experiencing so much harm in the process. And like that sense of urgency, like when I look at this list of characteristics of white supremacy, that's the one that stands out the most to me, right? Where it's like, are we going for harm reduction in the moment? Because like, that is literally saving people's lives. Like, and then that tension of like preventing burnout, but also like the ways that we go about, doing things quickly without being rooted in a value set that is about connection and people instead of just like the results of whether it's an action, a campaign, or an intervention in any given scenario. Like that's something hard to wrestle with. And I know that these characteristics that you listed are not like hard and fast rules. Like you can never do anything with a sense of urgency. Like if my nephew is about to run out into the street and there's a car coming, you best believe I'm going to act with a sense of urgency. But how do we hold that tension?
So, and this is why I'm doing the website, is so that I can explain these things a little bit more. So I'm talking about urgency as being the underlying culture of an organization, so that people never have a time, or a community or a group, so that people never, there's never space to take a breath. There's not space to reflect. There's not space to admit you made a mistake and learn from the mistake. No, we can't do that. We can't think about that right now because it's so urgent. Like everything's urgent. Everything has the same level of urgency. So that we fail to distinguish between things that really are urgent and things that aren't. And I say that in the context of the reality that racial justice is urgent. I mean, or justice is urgent. It's like it's urgent. It's like people are losing their lives because we are not because we need to be doing things differently than we are. So I'm not in any way suggesting that this takes time. We just need to give it time. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking more about urgency as a way of life, which means that we don't then breathe. We have no capacity to experience joy or connection with each other. And it definitely a culture of urgency reinforces power structures that are very harmful, because usually people in power will claim that things are urgent, which means that we don't have time to think about how racism is occurring because we have to get this piece of legislation out. You know, we can't talk about the fact that people who are affected by the legislation don't have any say in the legislation because the deadline is such and such. And I think white supremacy culture sets it up so that there are these constant deadlines. I think about foundations and the ways in which they set up deadlines and have these incredibly, often the less money that you're asking for, the more forms you have to fill out. Just all these constraints that are pushing on us all the time, that creates this sense of urgency, which disrupts connection. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I think about how, restorative justice work, like racial justice work, it belongs everywhere at all times. And there are people who are more willing to do that and people who are less willing to do that. I think one of the ways that Amplify RJ and I am trying to grow is taking this to people who are already trying to practice diversity, equity, inclusion, especially in a corporate setting. And I think that's a challenge because so much of the corporate world is, very hierarchical and top down. And, you have people who are experiencing the impact of those harmful actions at the bottom of the hierarchy, more willing to engage in the work, and people at the top maybe or maybe not being willing to do that. I think some of that is changing given where we are. How have you seen that change over the years of doing this work, and how do you think that we can invite more people into doing this work?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience in the corporate world. I will say that in the nonprofit industrial complex and in the social justice world, that dynamic is alive and well as well. And in some ways it can be, I shouldn't compare, it can be hard to penetrate. It's sort of the ways in which the anti-racism work, facilitation and teaching I do, can sometimes be harder to do with white people who identify as being liberal or anti-racist than it is with people who have no stake in their identity about being racist or not racist, because there's more layers to get through. There's more layers of defensiveness, like how, I don't want to look at my racism because my identity is that I'm anti-racist, and if I admit that I'm racist, you have more layers to get through. So I think in social justice circles, sometimes to admit that racism is happening can be harder because we're a social justice organization. Racism doesn't happen here, and I think there are any number of strategies, and I'm never going to claim to have the one right way, because then I would be contradictory. I would say that the work that I'm doing, the approach I'm taking currently, which is just one of many, is to really work with white people on our direct self-interest in racial justice and to help us see that we have a direct stake. This is not about helping BIPOC people in communities. This is not about a moral imperative. Both of those things can be at play, but this is about are you clear in your leadership role about your direct stake in this? And if you're not clear, you need to get clear about it. And once you get clear about it, you need to make sure that you have collective support to live into that clarity, because there are going to be so many pressures on you not to. So I think it's the other thing that I've been part of producing, in addition to the White Supremacy Culture article, is a set of racial equity principles that came out of collaborative work that I did with dRworks. So they're not mine at all; they're ours. But those principles have really, I've really come to lean on them. And so one of them is to know yourself, and another is to think and act collectively. So you can't know yourself in the absence of understanding yourself as part of a collective. So if you're leading, what does it mean to lead for equity? And how do you, what's the personal work that you have to do so that you can lean into your self-interest in racial equity and not allow the fear that's going to come at you to stop you? And you need support for that. So we need to help each other is basically my answer to that.
Yeah, I'm going to clip that and play that for so many people. You have no idea. And yes, like I do want to again shout out DRW, right?
So the collaborative doesn't exist anymore.
But the website is still up, and incredibly grateful for all the resources that are there. We'll also link that in the show notes because it's been so generative for our work, and I know for many other people. This work, like you were saying, like a lot of it is internal. And just looking at your bio, I didn't know this about you until I looked at it. You are this is deeply spiritual work as well, right? And that shows up in lots of different traditions, and whatever tradition listener that you are practicing or not practicing, that's not the most important thing. But the internal work, the whole person perspective that is needed in order to embody anti-racist values, right, is so important. You're a part of the Living School for Action and Contemplation and a member of the
Bumisparsha.
Yes, communities. Tell me how those have been impactful in strengthening your ability to do this work.
Can I do the long way around? Because what I want to say
absolutely.
is that part of our framework is that, and it's, many people have this framework, is that racism is more than personal. White supremacy is more than personal. It's cultural and it's institutional. And one of our racial equity principles is that we need to work on all three levels. So I would say that my participation in the Living School and Bumisparsha is my attempt to ground myself personally in my relationship to what I call the sea of love, our oneness. But it's not a sea of love, and it's not a oneness that denies the ways in which we are different. It's just my belief that we are all one. And then we have to move through all the ways that we're conditioned to be against each other for the purposes of capitalism and for the purposes of profit, and the ways in which we have very different lived experiences that mean I'm not going to know, as much as I may love you, I'm not going to know what your life is like, although I can be in a relationship with you anyway. So I think that the Living School is all about understanding Christian mysticism and this idea of being in relationship with God. If my father knew I was saying this, he would be appalled. My father was a fundamentalist atheist. And the Sangha practices, again, just learning. Both of these are sort of grounding me in trying to trying to live into this ethos of loving my neighbor as myself, and how very difficult that is because of how difficult I'm finding it to love myself, and how difficult it is to really love. I mean, love includes setting boundaries. Love includes walking away from people. Love includes, love is not easy. That's been my experience. Love is not easy. It's wonderful. It makes everything possible, and it can be really, really challenging to love someone who's on my very last nerve for any number of reasons.
I feel like the answer to this question might be self-preservation, but when it gets hard, what keeps you going?
My meditation practice, my friends, both of those things.
Yeah, and when you brought it earlier, when you talked about this is all about connection, right? Like that's what those two things do, like connection to yourself, connection to the oneness that is all of life, and then connection to others. And I think that's just like a beautiful distillation of all of this work. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Because then I'm going to transition us into the questions that I ask everyone that are like rapid fire-ish, but they don't often end up being rapid fire.
I think the only other thing I want to say is that you'd said that sometimes it's easier to say stop to those we know, and I will say that I also think sometimes it's difficult to say stop to those we know. I find it easier to say stop to people I'm not actually in a relationship with, because I'm not worried about breaking a relationship that doesn't exist. For me, I'm trying to learn the practice of saying stop to myself, so I have to often tell myself to stop, or to people I love, because I'm so afraid that if I say stop to someone I'm in a relationship with, well, if they have more power than I do, that I'll lose something, a job, something I actually need. But more importantly, if it's a parallel relationship, that I'll lose love. Like people, because we have so little practice being told stop and being able to hear it with grace. So I think one of the things that I don't talk about in the article, which I'm going to talk about more on the website, is just this. I think one of the huge skills, and I'm going to speak to white people now, for those of us who are white, is really the skill of learning to sit with how uncomfortable we can become when we really start to face our own conditioning, and the truth of how we might be behaving simply because we haven't thought about it before. I think I'm humbled by when I was teaching in undergraduates, I was teaching essentially a class about race, class, and gender to undergraduates who were going to be public school teachers, mostly white women. That's mostly who. But we had just done a class on some aspect of racism, and everybody left, and this young white woman stayed, and she was crying. And I said, so what's going on? And she said, I really understand what you're teaching. I believe what you're teaching, but now I can't go home. I can't go home with this information to my family. I don't know how to talk about this to my family. And that's the moment at which I started to be humbled about what we're asking. I'm not saying it's not necessary. It's completely necessary. I'm just humbled by what we're asking white people to do, who are so deeply steeped in a very subtle and persistent and relentless ideology that white is better, and how deeply embedded it is in our systems. And so I just I have a lot of respect for white supremacy in the sense that of its power, its adaptability, its deviousness, its subtlety. So it's partly why I think it's so important that we be in community with each other, because this is not anything that any one of us can do on our own. We really need each other, because this is the conditioning that we have is pretty serious stuff.
How do you approach that with people that you know that it's it's going to be difficult, or you feel like it's going to be difficult.
So another principle that we have is transparency, and I've just learned to say, I want to have this very difficult conversation with you, or I don't know that I'm going to do this right, or there's something I want to talk to you about and I'm scared. So I've learned to just be to admit that I'm whatever it is that I'm feeling before I launch into whatever it is. And I'll do that as a facilitator too. I'll do that in almost any role. It's like, and I can afford to do that because I have a lot of credibility as an older, white, upper middle class, college educated woman with a PhD. I can show my vulnerability, and there's still some people out there who will invalidate me for it, but mostly I can get away with it. I'm not suggesting everybody can do that, but that's my approach.
Yeah. I think like there's more risk for people who don't have those credentials, right? And yeah, I'm not telling you this to educate you, right? But like, when the intersections of your identity are more marginalized than that, there's so much more risk there. And that doesn't mean that you can't do that within the context of family, right? And I'm saying, like, in those contexts, like, it doesn't matter, like, those credentials don't matter as much, as long, like, with the caveat, as long as the relationship is there. And I know that's not the case for everybody within their family. But yeah, that is super tough.
If this was a one size fits all proposition, I joke that I would charge $500,000, come in and tell you the 5 things and leave. It's just, again, my respect for how devious and adaptable white supremacy and racism are is that context is everything, and who we are and the power we have or don't have, and what our relationships with each other are really have everything to do with how we move through it.
Yeah, one of the people who's been really influential for me is Miriam Kaba, prison abolitionist and all that. I just checked. She did change her Twitter name, but earlier last year, it was Try Everything 2020. Like, there are so many approaches to this work that, there's no one size fits all. There is no one right way. Yeah. To the questions that we ask everyone, I'm going to tweak this one because, restorative justice isn't necessarily your thing, but how do you define racial justice?
Wow, you'd think I'd have an easy answer to that one. I define racial justice as the point at which everyone can thrive physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually in community with each other.
Yeah, I think like the way that I would have tweaked it is like, what is your vision for like a racially just world? But I think that answer still fits.
And the white people, as long as racial categories still have power, that white people in the white community understand our direct stake, that we cannot be joyful, we cannot thrive, as long as our quote unquote prosperity or success depends on or is in any way tied to racism.
Yeah, for sure. With the caveat that this work belongs everywhere, what is one place or situation you really wish people could embrace this?
Well, I'm going to answer it with a category. I wish one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is leadership. So I wish leaders, wherever they are leading, could embrace this. So whether you're leading a social justice nonprofit, whether you're leading a corporation, whether you're a leader in government, whether you're a leader in your community, I wish that leaders understood that a racial equity commitment is the defining characteristic of leadership. I think one of the challenges we have on the left and in our movement is that we don't have a shared definition of meaningful, authentic, powerful leadership. And in my view, so it's not so much a sector as that those people in positions of leadership understand that a racial equity commitment is key to everything.
Yeah, and like I think like with the understanding that racism and white supremacy culture separates not just along lines of race, right? Like the intersections of all that as well, for sure. You get to sit in circle with 4 people that are alive. Who are they, and what do you talk about?
Oof, I can't answer this question. Oh my gosh, too many people. Naomi Shihab Nye, who's a Palestinian American poet. Angela Davis, Scott Nagakawa. Oh my goodness, Kara Page, who's actually a friend of mine.
And what do you all talk about?
What we think we can do towards the future for our children and our children's children. How we can be the ancestors that our children and children's children need and deserve and want.
Absolutely.
But please, no, that's oh my God, that question I can't.
It's meant to stretch you. I mean, and it's meant to just be fun, not stressful at all. No shade to anyone that didn't get name checked just now. This is this Restorative Justice Life podcast. How are you restoring yourself?
I have developed a pretty strong, and I'll shout out to Shangadora Wallace, who lives here in Durham, and introduced me to the idea of morning playlist. And the idea of a morning playlist is that there are any number of things that I might want to do in my morning, and I now wake up 3 hours before I have to do anything so that I have time to do my playlist. And my playlist includes a coffee. My playlist includes doing a game on the New York Times app. My playlist includes at least 30 minutes of meditation, at least 30 minutes of reading, some light yoga, and then centering before I start the day. So that has made it, so Shangadora has made that possible for me after a conversation we had about 2 or 3 years ago. And I've become amazingly devoted to my morning playlist. And the idea of a playlist is I don't have to do it in any particular order. And then I feel incredibly blessed by the community of friends that I feel held by, some local and some, so I just also just trying to do my best to keep my friendships going.
What's one thing you wish everyone listening to this podcast would know?
You are absolutely perfect, just as you are.
Thank you, Bruno Mars.
Okay, I would put him on the list.
Okay, so there's a caveat to this question, because you have to help me get them on, but who's one person I should have here?
I think you should invite Kara Page, who's doing some amazing, I don't know if you don't know of her, she's based in New York and is doing amazing work on sort of the racism of the medical industrial complex and somatics and the intersection of all of that. Who else? Susan Raffo, actually the two of them work together, who's based in Minneapolis, doing similar work. Either or both of them would be great.
So I will be looking forward to those introduction emails. And to close us out, how and where can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
So I am in the lucky situation of not needing financial support. I'm not based in an organization that needs financial support. So I think if you're talking about financial support, just continue to support Black and Brown-led efforts for racial justice. And if you want information support, the website is dismantlingracism.org. It's we try and keep it up to date, but we have not any devoted resources to it. But if there's a contact thing, if you have ideas for what could go on to the site, you can send those to me. That email comes to me. And then just keep an eye out for this White Supremacy Culture website when it launches, and then feedback and ideas for that. Apparently people have been doing artwork and all kinds of revisions and additions, which I find absolutely wonderful. And I'm going to have at least one page of those. So if you are doing that, or you know people who are doing that, once the website is up and want to share those with me so I can post them, that would be great.
Well, thank you so much. We'll get all the links to everything in the show notes, so people know how to access all those. It was really such a pleasure getting to meet you and to bounce these ideas off of somebody. Just speaking for myself, and I know for so many other people, the ideas that you've helped synthesize and share with the world have been really impactful. So thank you so much.
It's been a real honor and pleasure.
All right. That's it for this Restorative Justice Life this week. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. Until then, take care, and we'll see you. Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.